Creature Files, presented by the Department of Mythical Wildlife, with your hosts, author Todd Calgi Gallicano, Christopher McClary at the Sightings Desk, and resident skeptic Vic Afsahi. So sit back and listen as we report the latest news and up-to-date information about the mythical creatures living among us. The Creature Files. It might just save your life.
Hey everyone, and welcome to The Creature Files, the show that's all about mythical creatures, and it includes cryptids as well as creatures from folklore, whatever might be lurking in the woods, in the waters, or in the skies above. I'm your host, Todd Calgi Gallicano, the author of the Sam Lennon Adventure series from the files of the Department of Mythical Wildlife. And you can learn more about us online at mythicalwildlife.com. We ask that you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Creature Files. And now it's time to say hello to my co-hosts, Chris McClary at the Sightings Desk and our resident not-so-skeptic, Vic Afsahi. Hey, guys.
Hey, good to see you.
Okay, on to my background. As many of you know, every book in the Sam Lennon Adventure series features a few of our national parks. And to honor that on the podcast, my background will always be a national park, monument, forest. Any guesses what's behind me today, guys?
Is that the Colorado River?
No.
I'm going to say American River.
No. Six Rivers National Forest on the Oregon-California border is our background today. President Harry S. Truman established it by presidential proclamation in 1947. The Six Rivers National Forest includes nearly 1 million acres of mountainous land that stretches from the Oregon-California border south to Mendocino County. Elevations across the forest range from nearly sea level to approximately 7,000 feet. As a result, the Six Rivers supports diverse ecosystems and landscapes. The Six Rivers is named for the six major rivers that run within its boundaries: the Smith, Klamath, Trinity, Mad, Van Duzen, and Eel. It has more than 1,500 miles of streams. Rafting and kayaking are popular here, as well as fishing, camping, hiking, backpacking, and Bigfoot sighting. There's a reason we chose this as our background today. It ties into our topic, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, let's get to our Sightings Desk. Chris, anything sighted out there?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there is. We have, it looks like a sighting of the Beast of Exmoor. Now, this beast first, I guess, reared its head in the 1970s. So whether this is the same one, we don't know. But what is it? It's a phantom big cat, and it was spotted prowling in the countryside of Brayford in Devon, which is in England. And here we have this this fella. He is a, get this, a professional dog walker. He's out taking his dog for a walk, and he spots this giant cat going across a field. And he pulls out his camera and gets some footage of it. The footage, I think, is pretty good. It definitely is a mysterious looking creature. And he said it himself. He went down the list of creatures that he's familiar with, especially creatures native to that area. This didn't fit any of them. You know, he said it wasn't a cow, wasn't a deer, definitely not, you know, a pig. But he did say it was about the size of maybe a Labrador retriever, but it moved just like a large cat. So I just recommend you go check out the footage for yourself. It's pretty good footage considering what we usually get. This, I would say, is pretty satisfying.
Yeah, and we're going to show the footage here so people can get a look at it. Vic, anything to say about this?
Yeah, it looks like a panther that maybe escaped from a zoo, if it's not sort of, native to that area, because it looks and behaves just like a cat.
Yeah, you know, I guess, I don't know about a zoo because that would probably have been reported, but, one thing we learned from, I guess, Tiger King is that there are a lot of big cat enthusiasts out there, and they seem to be owning these animals in secret and under the radar. But I think sometimes it doesn't go, maybe they bit off more they could chew. They got more they bargained for with these animals, and they might even be releasing them into the wild. So it could be a case of that.
Yes, very interesting indeed. So we will just keep an eye out for other big cats that are making appearances and see if we get any other answers. Thanks so much. Now it's time for our creature feature and to learn why our background today connects with our subject matter. It has been 55 years since one of the most famous and controversial pieces of film in history was captured. There was a reason I chose Six Rivers National Forest as my background today, because that's where Bluff Creek is, a small tributary of the Klamath River in Del Norte County, California, the very famous site of what has become known as the Patterson-Gimlin film. It was on October 20th, 1967, that two former rodeo cowboys, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, headed into Six Rivers National Forest to check out an area that had been noted as having Bigfoot tracks. They came upon an area where they spotted something and started filming. And we'll play the film for our video viewers, but it shows what Patterson and Gimlin claimed was a large, hairy, bipedal, ape-like figure with short brownish hair covering most of its body. Patterson said he was only about 25 feet away from the creature and that his horse reared up. He finally got himself off his horse, grabbed the camera, and ran to capture footage of the creature. The resulting film is about 59.5 seconds long. At one point, the figure glances over its right shoulder at the men, and Patterson fell to his knees. Shortly after glancing over its shoulder on film, the creature disappeared behind a grove of trees for 14 seconds, then reappeared in the film's final 15 seconds. And then eventually it faded into the trees again. They filmed the prints of the creature and then tried following it 1 to 3 miles, but lost track of it. They headed back to camp, picked up plaster, returned to the initial site to make casts of the tracks. The creature would later become known as Patty, a female Bigfoot. Over the years, the film changed hands quite a bit and went around the world. It was analyzed by scientists, and the prevailing belief was that it was just another man in a suit. But the fact remained that it could not be totally debunked or proven. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, and he believes it's the real thing. He points to the quality of costuming and special effects in Hollywood at the time that the film was shot. He also points to the muscle movements of Patty, which make the idea of a man in a suit increasingly unlikely. Of course, there were individuals who emerged claiming to have created a costume for Roger Patterson, but there's also a story about how the film was taken to special effects experts at the time who cast serious doubt on whether such a costume could have been created with the technology that was available. Some of the most telling evidence comes from the prints that Patty left. As we heard from Cliff Barrickman in the Creature Files episode, Finding Bigfoot Evidence, the prints carry a characteristic that Meldrum has discussed at length, and that is a very distinctive pressure ridge, a push-off that comes about as a result of a very flexible midfoot. So what should we make of the Patterson-Gimlin film all these years later? We know there have been some efforts to clean up and increase the definition of the clip. Are we any closer to proving its authenticity or otherwise? Well, that brings us to today's guest. William Bill Munns has been an accomplished makeup and special effects artist in Hollywood for decades and a filmmaker in general. He has also worked with museums around the world creating realistic animal figures like prehistoric cats, primates, extinct hominids, and others. Intrigued by the prospect that the creature in the Patterson-Gimlin film could be a man in a suit, he applied his unique perspective to analyzing the clip. Using state-of-the-art analysis technology, Munns examined the film over 7 years, presenting his analysis in his book, When Roger Met Patty, which also contains material from Dr. Jeff Meldrum and provides a detailed analysis in both an academic and technical format. He created a website, www.themunnsreport.com, that summarizes his findings. All right, now it's time to get to our guest. I'm very honored to welcome Bill Munns on the show today. Bill, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we want to talk about first, I like to kind of get a feel for sort of how you got to where you are. So talk to us about how you came to all this. You know, you weren't setting out to become cryptozoologist of the year as you were named in 2014. How did this all happen?
Yeah, I will concede that was not my life ambition. I, in fact, didn't even know about the award until after it was given to me. I actually lived all my life in Southern California, grew up surrounded by people in the motion picture industry, so it's kind of natural that I would gravitate to the show business, movie, TV, and such. And I'd always been very fascinated by special effects and the particular specialty of special makeup effects, prosthetics, and costume creatures, monsters, all that kind of stuff. So most of my attention, most of my early learning, my education, and my ambition was directed toward the motion picture industry. And very quickly, I found I had quite an aptitude for special makeup effects and gravitated into that. As a matter of fact, when I was about 20 years old, I was hired to work at Universal Studios in Hollywood as one of their makeup artists. It was just doing the makeup show for the tourists, but still, it was actually put me inside the studio, and I could hang out in the makeup lab anytime I wanted, when I wasn't working. And Universal had a fabulous history of creating some of the greatest monster effects that had ever been done. So that kind of got me into the industry in this particular specialty of makeup effects, prosthetics, and such. I'd been always aware of cryptozoology in general. It always fascinated me, but I never really gave it any specialized attention. It was just, kind of a general curiosity, nothing more. So when the Patterson film was announced to the world in the late October of '67, and first pictures were published in 1968, I was aware of it at the time, but I was more focused on the reality of creating apes and ape-like creatures for motion picture, such as Planet of the Apes and the Dawn of Man sequence of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So pretty much throughout my career, I was always aware of these things about Bigfoot and such, but I was actually more concerned with the possibility of being hired to make a Bigfoot creature for a movie, more so than actually research the real phenomenon. But it was around 2008, I believe. I was reading an interview with someone who was a researcher on the Patterson film, and some of the things they were talking about suggested to me that they really didn't understand that much about ape suits, and that they may have never really talked to someone who'd actually built them. So I started doing some research thinking, well, maybe these people ought to talk to somebody who's actually made them. So I checked out a place on the internet called the Bigfoot Forum, which is a really wonderful place to learn about it all, and started contributing ideas to the forum about how ape suits and creature suits are actually made. And once I got into that and I realized how comprehensive the film was, how much there was to learn, how much there was to research, then I just sort of fell into it wholeheartedly and gave it years and years of diligent effort to try to sort out the mysteries of the Patterson film.
Yeah, and which is your report is like exhaustive report. I mean, I showed the book earlier, but this is, this is an incredible effort, in terms of it's just the breadth of it is extraordinary, and no one had ever done that. No one had ever really gone and done this kind of an investigation into that clip of film. I'm wondering, so what would you say would be like the first step in that journey for you? Do you reach out to people to get the better quality version of the clip, or do you just, like, how did you get a hold of it? Like, what was the sort of the mechanics of that?
The first step obviously was to collect all of the photographic material that was available. And the more I saw how much was available then, first I appreciated how much it was, but I realized how much was still absent from it. No one had a scan of every single individual frame of the entire film. So I couldn't find anyone who was in possession of that, and that was necessary to even begin a proper analysis. Luckily, the work that I had been doing caught the notice of the producers of the TV show Monster Quest. And they asked me to appear on one of their segments discussing the film. And they were willing to finance some of my research efforts that allowed me to get the photographic equipment to actually build a custom frame scanning device that I could take apart, put into some suitcases, and I could go to the person who had the copy, because most people who have a copy of the film, they don't want to let it out of their sight. They worry, if I send it to somebody, will they send it back? Will they keep it? Will I lose it? What'll happen? So the people who had copies would let me look at them, but only in their presence, which means I had to go to them. So the first person that was arranged for me to go see was John Green up in Canada. And John had several copies of the film. He had quite a bit of footage in his archive. And so I built this custom scanning device, took it up there, met with him, and in the hotel room that I had in his town, he brought the film over, and I put it into the scanning system. And I scanned every individual frame of the film that he had, plus some other bits of footage I was able to scan as well. But when I got home and I analyzed it, I found out what I had wasn't true full frame. It was slightly cropped. So I still had to search around for a true full frame copy of the film. And Mrs. Patterson, Roger's widow, had a copy that was her archive copy. She kept usually in a safe deposit box in the bank. And another television production company was interested in my research, and they made the arrangement for me to go up to Yakima, Washington to meet Patricia. And I took my scanning equipment with me, set it up in her living room, and she got her copy of the film out of the vault, and we put it into the scanning system while she was sat there watching everything. And I was able to scan her copy of the film, which was a true full frame. So now I had two complete scans of the entire film, every single frame. And then I started accumulating more. I bought two different versions of it from eBay that were offered for sale. And then I started gaining the trust of other people who had copies. And I ended up building up an archive of more than 20 different copies of the film, which allowed me to do analysis that no researcher had ever done before.
That's extraordinary. That must have been kind of an amazing sort of moment when Roger Patterson's Widows brings out his copy of the film for you to scan that's been sort of hidden away for so long.
Yeah, it was, in fact, the same one that you usually see on TV. But because I was scanning at a very high resolution, it was one of the finest quality scans of this film that had ever been done. So that was certainly an advantage.
Now, I have seen, like on YouTube, there are these copies of it that are a couple of years ago, it was like a 4K restoration of the film that people have sort of scrutinized. Do you have anything to tell us about that?
Yeah, I was actually the first person who scanned the film at 4K. All of the scanning I did was at a 4K resolution. So I was actually the first one who ever attempted that. A lot of the ones that are now on the internet are actually based on scans from my archive collection. Wow. So other people are using that material. There's a few other sources of material that people are sometimes using as well. But the 4K is the proper resolution to evaluate it at, because you really are seeing 100% of the image data that is in the pictures. So it's actually a good thing that we're now finally working at that resolution.
So you start this sort of journey, you go and you get these, high quality scans of the film, and then you start putting together this report. So I wanted you to sort of talk to us about your report, and we'll put the information up for people to go and find it online as well. Maybe you can kind of walk us through sort of that process as you started to build this case, in a sense.
Okay. Basically, once I got to scanning quite a few copies, it allowed me to see the potential of doing forms of analysis that no one had done before. And with those particular ideas of what kind of analysis could be done for the first time, I had the good fortune to become acquainted with Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and Jeff connected me with some people who were willing to produce or provide research grants that would cover the cost, because the research actually does cost a fair amount of money if you're going to do it right. There's a lot of equipment, a lot of materials, a lot of time and effort by various people, their labor cost, a workshop where you can do it. So there's a lot of expenses involved. But Jeff was kind enough to help me to get some research grants that afforded us the opportunity to do research in a way that had never been done before, to actually build costumes and test them and see if they would do what we see happens in the film. So once I had the research work done, courtesy of these grants, that basically gave me enough information to be able to finally pull it together and produce the report that chronicles all the various research efforts.
So that's a fascinating part of this is the actual point at which you start to try to build or create a costume that might mimic what we see if it is indeed, a man in a costume.
Right.
And when you did that, were you sticking with sort of what the technology was at the time for creating it?
Yeah, that was absolutely essential. Excuse me. In terms of fur costumes, ape suits, and the like, the technology has changed radically since the time of the film, which is 1967. And there are technologies today that are quite awesome in their capability. But because they weren't available in 1967, they had to be dismissed as of no consideration in trying to analyze the Patterson-Gimlin film. So yes, I had to work specifically with materials that I knew for a certainty were readily available and commonly used in the late 1960s. Now, given that I started learning makeup in 1967 and started working at Universal Studios as a makeup artist in 1969, that put me in a position where I knew to a certainty what materials were in fact available. But when I was doing the research, I was able to confine myself only to the materials that actually were available at the time. And that would have been an essential step for anyone trying to scientifically research and analyze this particular film and come to any kind of a reliable conclusion.
What can you tell us about that in terms of like when you did attempt it? What were the aspects of it that were sort of impossible to sort of recreate, that lent itself more to this idea that this was obviously a real creature and it was not a man in a suit? Were there particular things about creating the costume that made it sort of blaringly obvious that there were things that just didn't work, didn't make sense?
Yeah, actually quite a few. One of them is the size of the head. Now, when we build an ape head for a human to wear, we have to pull the mouth out quite a bit to create kind of a projecting muzzle on the face. We often have to pull the eyebrow out quite a bit as well, because we want to try to make it look like the head slopes backward instead of a human head where the cranium rises straight up from the brow ridge. So we have to pull the eyebrows out so that it seems to kind of slope back into the head. That makes it look a little more ape-like. When you enlarge all of these features, you end up with a head which is pretty big, much bigger than the human head underneath it. Well, the head of the subject figure we see in the Patterson film has a remarkably small head. And her face is relatively flush from the brow, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin. It's all relatively flush. And right above the brow, it literally goes straight back toward the back of the head. And it's very small in form. So trying to get a mask in that shape that a human could actually wear is almost impossible. I did scale the figure up to my height so I could test it on myself. And scaled the head accordingly, and then sculpted a head from the various pictures at that particular scale. And when I tried it on, if I just slipped it over my head, I couldn't even see out of it because the eye socket was way above my own eyes. If I tilted the mask way down so that I could actually see through the eyes, I was looking straight down at the ground, and the mask was pointing downward as if the creature was looking at his own toes. And we don't see that in the film. So there was no way that I could get this mask to be worn by myself or a human like me that would replicate the posture that we see in the film. So that would be one thing. The second thing is the smoothness in the back of the neck. In the old days, when we didn't have stretch fur, you'd either disconnect the head from the torso on a costume, which would leave a gap between the two, or you would build a lot of loose extra fabric so that when the person turned their head, this loose fabric would allow them to turn it. And to hide all that loose fabric, you'd make a big lump out of the shoulders so the neck sort of sits deep down between the two shoulders, and you don't notice all this loose fur. Those were basically the two techniques for dealing with the blend of a head mask to a torso body suit. Well, what we see in the film doesn't have either of those characteristics. It has no gap in between it, but it's perfectly smooth surface from head through neck into torso, which defies everything that a costume neck could have been accomplished with back in those times. So that's the second element. The third is the fact that the figure is a female, and she has a fairly substantial set of mammary glands. And when you look at it closely and it's properly analyzed, there actually is a certain amount of fluid movement to the breast mass when she's moving, especially when she steps and she kind of crashes down when the ground is lower than she expected. And she takes kind of a hard step down. There's a motion in the breast mass that's very, very distinctive. And so I tested if any costume prosthetics where you make a prosthetic breast and you put it on the chest section of the costume. We tested that specifically to see if any of those would create a fluid movement like what we see in the film. And all of these prosthetic materials tested, everything that was available in 1967, failed completely to show any kind of motion. So you have the shape and size of the head, pretty much rules out a human. You have the neck itself, which pretty much rules out a costume. And you have the fluidity of the breast mass, which pretty well eliminates any possibility of the prosthetic materials of the time being used just to create a costume of a female figure with breasts.
I was going to say, I mean, if someone was to create a costume for this, why would they have complicated their lives by making it a female in this case with a particular, prosthetic that would be needed in order to mimic that? Like, to me, it's almost, it's just counterintuitive that if you were going to go through the motions of trying to create a hoax and you wanted to make sure it was as believable as possible at the time, you would stay within the confines of what was available to you and not try to stretch in a makeup effects way that wasn't really possible at the time. It's almost, to me, the fact that it's Patty and not Pat is makes it more believable. Just, why complicate it? If you're going to fake it and you're these two rodeo guys, from my perspective, the more I sort of dive into this, I see that there's sort of these moments where you go, why would they do that? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of people don't realize this, but in the history of movie monsters, you almost never see anything which can be determined to be female. I mean, there may be one or two, like the robot woman in the movie Metropolis. But generally speaking, creatures made in the movie have no gender. And that is literally the tradition of old Hollywood and monsters and creatures. So, yeah, if somebody were making the costume suit, they would make it without gender. It's like Chewbacca in Star Wars. Is he a boy or a girl? We don't know. There's nothing about him that tells us his gender or her gender, whichever it might be.
Yeah.
But anyways, so yes, you are correct. It would be very illogical for a person making a Bigfoot costume to put any secondary characteristics that indicate gender on the suit. They just make it a big hairy figure and leave any issue of gender out of it. So yeah, making it a female figure is actually defying all of the tradition of movie costume creature work.
Yeah, and obviously the film has been controversial because they attack Roger Patterson, they attack all the different aspects of it, and then there are people that come out of the woodwork that are that claim this or claim that. Where do you sort of stand on talking about costumes? There was a gentleman that came out, I think he was from North Carolina, Morris was his last name, and he said, "Oh, I created the costume." And then there was this other individual, Bob Hieronymus, I believe, who said, "Oh, I wore this costume," but yet Morris couldn't recreate it, from what I understand.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Philip Morris made theatrical costumes, and the kind of low-grade costume that you might rent from a costume shop to go to a Halloween party. That kind of a costume is so far removed from what we see in the film. There's simply no relation, and even the idea that Roger modified such a costume is just unthinkable. So his claim is without merit in terms of saying that what we see in the Patterson film is his costume. No, it absolutely positively is not. The issue with Bob Hieronymus is actually a little more curious. See, most people think that the question is a purely binary question. It's a yes or a no. If the film is real, then Bob Hieronymus and Philip Morris are mistaken. They're not telling you the truth. If they are telling the truth, then the film must be a fake. People think it's an either or. It's an absolute. There actually is a third possibility I've been researching, and that is that Roger may have, in fact, acquired a costume, possibly from Morris. He may have put Bob Hieronymus in it. He may have taken him in the woods and filmed him. But the footage was so silly and so obviously fake that it was useless. He just set it aside, went back to his expeditions, and then came across the real thing and photographed it, which is the Patterson film. So it is possible that it may have happened that way. And if so, then Morris could have been telling the truth, saying he sold Roger a costume. And Bob Hieronymus could be telling the truth, saying, yeah, I wore a costume and Roger filmed me. But still, it's not the Patterson film. Now, I'm exploring that. I don't have a conclusive determination one way or another whether this is what transpired. But it wouldn't have been unreasonable, because a person making a documentary film about Bigfoot or something like that will very often get a costume and put somebody in it and have them walk around in the woods and film them, just to kind of create a suggestion of this is what the encounter might have looked like. This is a recreation of what might have happened, kind of a thing. So for a documentary producer making a thing about Bigfoot, it was actually very reasonable to get a costume and put somebody in it and film them. So if Roger did that, he wasn't doing anything unusual as a documentary filmmaker. So while most people see the issue of Philip Morris and Bob Hieronymus as pure yes-no, I think there's a gray area in between where they may be telling the truth as much as they know it for part of what happened, but it still does not affect the fact that the Patterson-Gimlin film, as we know it, is truly, absolutely authentic.
Yeah, I agree. I had the same thought in that, it's not necessarily, there's a little bit of a gray area. It's not either because they could be telling the truth and therefore it's hoax, or, the other way, it was like, well, we know that Roger, that there was this documentary that they were looking into. They were interested in it. I mean, it could very well have been that they shot something like this for B-roll footage while while interviews were playing or what have you, to sort of give you this idea of what that kind of creature, in the context of that documentary, it would make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, I can also tell you just a little about how I came to this idea. There's a gentleman named Harry Kemble who put out a letter that Bigfoot researchers acquired around 1905. And he said that in 1967, he was working for Canna West Labs up in Canada, just above the border. And that Roger and a friend came in one day with some film that they showed the people in the lab of a guy, a friend of his, dressed up in an ape costume, running around in the woods. Now, this guy, Harry Kemble, describes the film he saw that day very, very specifically. Says it was an ectochrome type film stock. Said it was overdeveloped. The common vernacular term then is cooked in hot soup or pushed, but it means overdeveloping a film to compensate for underexposure. Makes it very grainy. He said that Roger was zooming in on the figure and sometimes going out of focus when they zoomed in, and that he was using a camera other than the K100 that Roger used for the Patterson film. But he described all of these things very specifically. And a person who works in a lab would know all of these things, and it would know exactly what they mean. So if he says it's ectochrome, he had a zoom lens, the film was pushed, the camera wasn't a K100. If he says all of these things, he probably is speaking very factually. Now, the Patterson film is none of those. Photochrome film, not ectochrome. There's no zoom lens. It's a standard prime 25 millimeter lens. The film is not pushed to make it grainy. It's superbly developed, absolutely perfectly exposed, perfectly developed. And we know for a certainty Roger used a camera called a Kodak K100 model, a spring-wound camera. But Roger shot a lot of other documentary footage that I got access to. And in looking at his other footage, I noticed he shot a lot of ectochrome film. There's one reel that was so grainy, it scared me when I looked at it, and I realized it was overdeveloped. It was pushed. He used a zoom lens on a lot of this documentary footage, and he used cameras other than a K100. See, we can identify the type of camera by certain marks that it actually embeds into the sides of the film. It's called a camera identification mark. So we can look at the film, and usually we can tell you what kind of camera was used to make it. So I can look at Roger's documentary footage and say, yeah, this stuff was shot with a K100. This was shot with something else, maybe an Aeroflex or a Bolex, right? So Roger did shoot film on ectochrome stock that was overdeveloped in the lab with a zoom lens, and he shot with cameras like an Aeroflex or a Bolex, cameras other than a K100. So everything that Harry Kemble described seeing matches Roger's other footage. So that led me to think maybe Roger really did shoot somebody in a suit, exactly as Kemble described technically, not the Patterson-Gimlin film, but Roger actually did it. So that's actually what started me on this investigation and opened up this idea to me. I'm still not at a point where I can say conclusively it is a fact, but I'm continuing to investigate it.
So interesting. Now, as we look back, it's been many years, and then you had this report, and you've done this book, and is there anything that's still for you sort of an unanswered question that would, beyond this particular one we just discussed, some unanswered question about the film that you're still sort of seeking an answer to help you in your analysis?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Probably the biggest single question I'm still working on is the question of how tall she was. There are other theories that people have offered up. One is to use the size of her foot compared to the known footprint casts that were taken at Bluff Creek, and then calculating her height according to that. Another researcher, a man named Jeff Glickman, used elements in the background, the environment, that could have been measured after the fact by people going to Bluff Creek, and tried to scale her to these other elements. So there are several ways that people have attempted to determine her height, but none of them are absolutely conclusive. Now, my theory is to try and use an analysis of the camera lens and the environment so that we can calculate her size on film and how that translates into real physical size. My problem with that, though, is that somewhere there's an error in all of the data that I've collected. Because I can run it one way and I get one answer. I can run it another way and I get a different answer. And obviously only one of those answers can be correct. So there's an error somewhere in the data, and I'm still sifting through all of this information, try to find the error and eliminate it from the calculation so that I can make a final determination of her height. When I do that, that I feel would be a very important contribution of new information to our understanding of the film. So that's one that I'm definitely still working on.
You've spent a lot of time looking at this particular clip. Are there any other film clips of Bigfoot that you've, or cryptids that you've looked at, examined, analyzed, or maybe just cursorily sort of looked at and thought looked interesting and deserved more attention?
Well, sadly, most of the stuff that I see is such a poor quality that there's just no way to analyze it. It's too fuzzy, it's too blurry. The subject figure is buried in the foliage of the leaves and bushes and everything, to the point that the only way you can find her is somebody draws a red circle around a mass in the leaf, say, yeah, that's it. You know, as soon as you draw a red circle around it, you're admitting you have no usable information that can be analyzed, really nothing. I've only seen two that were really very, very sharp and clear, and sadly, both of them I had to conclude were fakes. So I haven't seen anything authentic as good as the Patterson film. Now, if you go back to 1967, somebody was hoaxing this, and they tried to imagine how it would be analyzed in the future. There is no way they could have even, in their wildest imagination, understood the technology we have today to analyze. Because when, in 1967, there was no such thing as digital images. There was no such thing as computer graphics. Computers didn't even have monitors or TVs that they were connected to. They were just connected to a printer. We didn't even see computer graphics start until going into maybe the middle or late 80s, and then finally blossoming in the 90s. So in 67, you could not have imagined technology we're using to analyze it, and that favors very strongly for our analysis, because we know we're not dealing with a clever hoaxer who's creating false positives. There's no way that person could have anticipated the analysis we're doing. So we know when we do the analysis, we're confident that it is faithful, it is accurate, and it is correct.
And not just the actual like technology involved in the analysis of the, you know, the what's happening on the film and the film itself, but there's this other aspect, and I know you talked about bringing in Dr. Meldrum in this. There's information about the way the creature moves, and also in the tracks that speak to an understanding of that type of creature that wasn't necessarily understood completely at the time. Is that correct?
Mhm. Yes, definitely. Well, I think to me the most remarkable thing is the anatomy of the subject figure. She has a very long torso, very long arms, and very short legs. Now, humans who are at average height or below average height tend to have shorter legs. Humans who are above average in height in general gain that extra height by longer legs. So if she is indeed a fairly large figure, and the height estimates that other people have come up with are anywhere from 6 foot to 7 foot, thereabouts. If she were of that height should have been generated more by extra length in her legs. Rather than having short legs, she should have long legs.
Mm-hmm.
We see the exact opposite on the film. And then we look at the skull, and we see this skull with a flat face and the head sloping straight back. And if we look at the anthropological studies of human origins and human ancestral forms, there's one particular one called, originally it was called Zinjanthropus boisei. Now it's been reclassified Paranthropus boisei. But it lived about 1,300,000 years ago. And it has a skull almost identical to what we would expect to see on the lady in the Patterson film. So she could conceivably be a derivative of that human ancestor, literally a branch that split off and somehow got up north out of Africa into Asia, crossed the Bering Strait land bridge into North America, settled in here. That is entirely possible. And the Paranthropus boisei, as well as Neanderthal, also had a physique where the legs were a little bit shorter relative to the torso and the arms. So we see these things that we understand, and we connect these anthropological things to what we see in the film, and the connections are quite fascinating.
Well, right now, I'd love to bring in my co-hosts and see if they have any questions. Chris, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple. Bill, thanks for being here with us tonight. Really, this has
Sure,
been
my pleasure.
illuminating. I've learned so much, and so much has been brought to my attention that I wasn't aware of before. But one thing that really piqued my interest is that you saw other films that he made or had shot, and you were mentioning a little bit about the unique, different styles and things that were emerging. I'm wondering, what was the subject matter of those films? Like, what other things did he like to shoot, or was he shooting at the time? I know he was with the rodeo. Was there like rodeo footage? What was his role in the rodeo? And do we know what he was out there to shoot that day that he got this film?
Okay, first dealing with his other documentary footage. Most of it was related to his intention of producing a documentary about Bigfoot. Some of it is a man named Fred Beck, whom he had interviewed also for his book. The man had experienced a sighting, and he wanted to document his sighting. So he did some footage of this man that he would use. He also had an old VW bus, and he had a sign on the roof that said Bigfoot Expedition 67. And he has some footage of him in a redwood forest, which is presumably Northern California, and footage of his bus, just showing him driving around doing his research. Those are the kind of things that he was filming. I'm sure that there's a lot more that I haven't seen that would be more relevant to his documentary. But these were just things, that he was shooting here and there, this and that. But to look at the footage is wonderful because it shows you he uses both Kodachrome and Ektachrome. It shows you he uses different cameras, shows you he uses zoom lenses as well as primes. And it does show, as I mentioned, that sometimes he did have to push the film to have the lab force develop it to compensate for underexposure in the camera. So that meant that he was a fairly sophisticated cameraman. Now, he rented his K100 camera in May of '67. So he was filming all of this stuff all through the summer. Bill had the same camera in October, when he decided to go to Bluff Creek in Northern California. And he specifically decided to go there because 2 months before, John Green and Renee DeHinden, two other researchers, had been down there and they found a trackway they were investigating. So they called Rogers home. He was out on an expedition, but his wife, Patricia, answered. She took the message that there's a trackway in Northern California he should know about. But when Roger came back home, Patricia gave him the message. That's when he decided his next trip would be to go to the Northern California areas and Bluff Creek specifically. So that's actually what motivated him to go there. And he still had his camera, so he took it along with him just in case he was actually hoping to find that trackway still undisturbed so he could photograph it. Wasn't able to do that, but he was hoping. That's one of the reasons he had the camera with him. So that's how it all kind of came about. Vic,
do you have any questions for Bill?
I was just going to ask, do you, and thank you so much for this. This has been a real treat for us. What is your confidence level on the film being real or possibly fake? Do you believe it's 100% real at this point?
Yeah, 100%, no question.
Very cool. For me, just being an individual, I've always been torn, and because it does seem, it seems so much to be unhuman-like in so many ways. Like you're saying, the head part is really the most convincing to me. The problem that I have, just from the evidence as I know it, is just the shape of the foot versus the cast that they took. Is there any other evidence that we should take into consideration when feeling out that discrepancy?
Well, yeah, you do have to understand that almost all the film that you see has lost detail because it's been copied several times. Almost everything you see is second generation copy or worse. Every time you copy film, you lose a little bit of quality. And the whole entire figure, the entire head to toe body of the figure, is only about 1/7 of the size of that frame. And that frame on the real film is only like 7 millimeters high. So the entire figure is like literally 1 millimeter high in the film. Film grain compared to a figure of that size means that you really can't resolve anything accurately below about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. And your toes are about that size. So they're right on the edge of not being able to resolve. So we can't really see the detail of the foot as much as we'd like. And the few stills that do show the foot raised up so we can actually see the bottom of the foot, most people don't realize that when the foot is raised up that way, you're in the middle of a step cycle. You're walking. And the foot is just starting to accelerate forward to take that forward step, which means there's more motion blur on that foot than there is on the body. And that motion blur also impacts our ability to distinguish the detail of the foot. So if we can't quite reconcile the foot to the footprint, it's because the photographic constraints are such that we can't actually determine a precise shape of the foot as much as we'd like based upon the film. It's just down right on the threshold of being below resolution plus the motion blur factor. So those distort it a little bit and could distort it enough that it's hard to make the comparison.
Do we know what happened to the original negative? Is that like in an archive somewhere? Or?
No. Roger gave it to a company in Utah called American National Enterprises, or ANE. And they made a documentary called Bigfoot, Man or Beast that was released in 1971. Roger participated with them on producing the film, and he appears in it. He's even talking in the film. And so they, of course, have his footage in there. Well, when Roger passed away in January of 72, the least thing the family was concerned with was, where's the film? I don't think it ever crossed their mind. And it was still in the possession of A&E. Well, they went bankrupt around, I believe, 1984. And their office supplies and equipment and everything, their assets, were all just basically auctioned off. Now, the story that I have heard from various sources is that a company bid on their office equipment, including their file cabinets and desks and things like that. And when they got the shipment of the file cabinets and they went through them, in one of those file cabinets was the original film. Now, they looked at it, figured out what it was, thought that it might be valuable, so they put it into a film vault in Southern California so that they could hopefully preserve it while they sorted out who really owns it, because Patricia and Bob Gimlin are the legal owners of the film with all rights. So even though these people legally owned this physical copy, they had no right to show it to anybody. Now, Renee DeHenden purchased Bob Gimlin's rights to the film. And oddly enough, Bob Gimlin had 51%, Patricia had 49%. That's how a judge in a court ruled. So Renee DeHenden purchased Bob Gimlin's 51%. He then went to that lab, the film vault in Southern California, and he told them, look, I'm 51% owner of this film, so I have a right to check it out because I want to do some new analysis on it. They apparently thought his claim was legitimate because they gave it to him. He gave the film to a man named Bruce Bonney, who did a very, very comprehensive analysis of the camera original. But for reasons that we haven't been able to sort out yet, the film never got back to the vault. Whether Renee kept it, or whether Bruce Bonney kept it, or whether they took it back to the lab and gave it to somebody who didn't check it in and kept it, we don't know. But somebody kept it, and it sort of disappeared. That was around early 1980s. But we don't know actually what happened to it. We're still hoping we'll find it one day, but
It's only like two films that, you can name and generations of people know what you're talking about. It's Zapruder and it's Patterson-Gimlin.
exactly.
The fact that one is lost to, the mysteries of man, that's incredible. So thank you for that information. That's a fascinating history.
So what does the future hold for you, Bill?
Well, I do have more research I would like to do on the film. It's just a question of acquiring funding to do it, because the research that we want to do does require some substantial costs in terms of equipment, materials, resources, and such to do it. But there are still things to learn from the film, and so I do hope to pursue that. But I do have, it's not that this is my whole life and I'm staking my legacy on being the guy who analyzed the Patterson film. I do have other ambitions with other media projects and of software development, different things like that I'm also involved in. So I've actually got quite a few things that I'm still working on and trying to develop for the future.
Now, how can people follow your work?
Well, there's the Munns Report website, although I haven't updated it in a while. There is, of course, my book, When Roger Met Patty. There may be another one coming out in the next few years. I'm hoping to do kind of an encyclopedia of all of the research material so that other researchers can see what there is available and they can do their research based upon all of this. And hopefully in that I can sort of put to rest so many of the rumors and the questions and, all of the suspicions that are floated around. So it would be like one standard reference source you can go to literally answer any question about the film. So I'm hoping to get that published in the future. Thank
you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. This has been incredibly insightful to hear from you and to hear these particulars about this incredible film that has sort of stood the test of time in terms of keeping us guessing and keeping us questioning and wondering, what exactly that was and what it means in the grand scheme of things. So thank you so much for all the work you've done.
Oh, you're most welcome. And thank you so much for inviting me to your program.
That was Bill Munns, author of When Roger Met Patty, an exhaustive look at the Patterson-Gimlin film. Guys, what do you think?
Well, first of all, that was incredible. What a guest. I mean, I learned so much. There's so much, his details, his subject matter expertise. You know, I mean, just the amount of information and knowledge he has about every step of the process, from from costume development and as well as cinematography and knowledge of cameras. It really shows that he knows what he's talking about.
And Vic, what did you think of Bill and the information he provided?
A terrific guest, so knowledgeable. I like, his approach to, kind of disproving through trying to reproduce, or proving through not being able to reproduce, I should say. I like his analysis, down to the millimeter on what we're dealing with that original film. We're extracting so much data out of such a small print, and it's convincing. It's very interesting. It's given me a lot to think about. So yeah, it's just really, really great to talk to him.
Yeah, I found this interview fascinating. I mean, this is a film that's been with us over 50 years now. And there have been all of these questions, and Bill has gone and just done this incredible investigation into it. And some of these aspects that we don't necessarily think about just make you wonder, is like, how could it be a hoax? In so many ways, there are things that just don't make sense. There are a lot of unanswered questions, but whether you definitively, I don't think you can say one way or the other with what we know. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Creature Files. If you want more information, please head to our website at mythicalwildlife.com, or you can follow us on Facebook. Please don't forget to subscribe to the show. And if you've had a sighting, report it at info@mythicalwildlife.com. You might wind up on the show. Thanks again for joining us. And until next time, always remember to heed your call to
Adventure.
The Creature Files. It might just save your life.